It all began with a simple knock on my door. I thought it was just another stranger, maybe a neighbor, maybe someone selling something, but when I opened it, there she was. A policewoman, standing tall in her uniform, her eyes soft but steady, her voice calm yet powerful. I didn't know it in that moment, but that knock was about to change everything in my life. That night was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels heavy, when even the ticking of the old wall clock sounds louder than it should. I was sitting alone, curled up on the couch with a blanket wrapped around me, sipping tea that had already gone cold. My apartment was small, nothing special, but it had always been my safe space. Still, it often felt too silent, too empty, as if the walls were echoing back at me the loneliness I carried inside. When the knock came, it startled me. It was sharp and firm, not hesitant like a neighbor or light like a friend. My chest tightened with sudden unease, and I set my cup down, walking slowly to the door. When I opened it, I expected maybe a delivery gone to the wrong address, but instead I found her standing there. A policewoman, tall, with her uniform neat and crisp, her presence filling the doorway in a way that was both authoritative and strangely comforting. For a moment, I didn't speak. I just stared, caught off guard by the mix of seriousness in her expression and the warmth in her eyes. She introduced herself calmly, explaining she was visiting homes in the area as part of a safety check. Her voice was steady but had a softness underneath, and though her words were routine, I found myself listening as if each syllable carried weight. I nodded along, trying to appear composed, though inside I felt nervous for no clear reason. It wasn't just her uniform or the way she carried herself, it was something about the way she looked at me, like she wasn't just scanning the room for potential dangers but noticing me as a person. I invited her inside, not out of obligation, but because something about her presence made me want her to step in. She walked in with polite care, glancing briefly around my modest living room. I caught myself adjusting things that didn't need adjusting, straightening a cushion, moving the cold teacup out of sight, as if her opinion of my home mattered more than it should have. She asked simple questions about the neighborhood, about whether I felt safe here, whether I had noticed anything unusual lately. I answered each one, but my mind was distracted, not by the questions, but by the way her tone softened each time she looked directly at me. Her eyes weren't the kind of eyes that made you nervous, they were the kind that made you feel heard. And in that moment, I realized how long it had been since I had felt that from anyone. The conversation could have been over in minutes, but somehow it stretched on. She made small jokes here and there, light remarks that broke the seriousness of her role, and I laughed, an easy laugh, the kind I hadn't heard from myself in a long time. It surprised me how natural it felt to let my guard down with her, even though I barely knew her name. When she finally stood to leave, I felt a flicker of disappointment, which made no sense. She had only come for her job, nothing more, and yet the thought of her walking out that door left an emptiness I couldn't explain. She thanked me for my time, gave me a reassuring smile, and told me to reach out if I ever needed anything. Just before she stepped out, her eyes lingered on mine for a second longer than necessary. It was subtle, but I felt it. That silent moment hung between us, and even after she left, closing the door behind her, the air in the room felt charged. I leaned against the door, my heart beating harder than it should have for such a simple interaction. I told myself it was nothing, just a random visit, just a kind officer doing her duty. But as I went back to the couch and sat staring at the empty teacup, her face kept flashing in my mind. The way she smiled, the way her voice softened, the way her presence filled the silence I usually hated. That night, I couldn't sleep. I tossed and turned, restless, my thoughts circling back to her again and again. I tried to dismiss it as my imagination playing tricks on me, but deep down I knew something had shifted. It wasn't just the knock on the door that startled me, it was the way she made me feel seen in a way I hadn't felt in years. Something had begun, quietly and unexpectedly, and though I didn't understand it yet, I could feel it was going to change me. The next morning felt heavier than usual, as if I had carried her presence into my dreams and woken up with it still pressed against my chest. I made coffee, but I barely drank it, just sat there staring out the window and replaying every second of the night before. The sound of her voice, the curve of her smile, the way her eyes lingered just long enough to stir something deep in me, it all stayed vivid, like my mind refused to let it go. I told myself it was foolish. She was just a policewoman doing her job, nothing more. But the truth was, the memory of her had already rooted itself inside me, and the silence of my apartment felt even louder now that she was gone. Hours passed, and though I busied myself with little tasks, folding laundry, washing dishes, pretending to read a book, I couldn't stop thinking about the knock that had changed everything. Then, as if the universe was listening to the chaos in my chest, another knock echoed through the room. My heart leapt before I even stood up. I knew that sound, firm but not harsh, familiar already in some strange way. I opened the door, and there she was again. This time, her expression was lighter, not so official, though she was still in her uniform. She explained there had been some follow-ups regarding safety in the building, and she wanted to ask a few more questions. But the way she spoke was different this time, softer, less like an officer talking to a resident and more like a woman talking to another woman. I stepped aside to let her in, and as she walked past me, I caught the faint scent of her perfume, subtle, clean, and oddly comforting. We sat in the living room again, but this time the atmosphere felt different. She asked about the neighbors, about whether I had noticed anything strange in recent weeks, but her eyes gave away that she wasn't in a rush to leave. The conversation shifted naturally, almost without either of us realizing it. She mentioned how late her shifts often went, how exhausting it could be to always carry the weight of responsibility, and for a moment I saw the human side of her, the side hidden behind the badge and uniform. I listened closely, nodding, feeling honored that she was letting me glimpse into her world. And then she asked about me, my work, my life, how long I had been living here. No one had asked me those things in a long time with such genuine curiosity. I found myself speaking more than I intended, telling her small pieces of my story, about the loneliness that crept into my nights, about how difficult it was to find connections that lasted. She didn't judge, didn't interrupt, she just listened, her gaze steady, her presence grounding me in a way that made me feel safe to open up. At one point, she made a small joke about how she wished she could trade her noisy precinct for the kind of quiet my apartment held. I laughed, and the sound seemed to light up her face. It wasn't forced laughter, it was real, spilling out before I could stop it, and in that moment I realized how much I had missed the simplicity of laughing with someone. The air between us grew warmer, and though we never touched, I felt an invisible pull drawing us closer. There were pauses where we just looked at each other, and in those pauses, everything unsaid seemed louder than the words we spoke. I noticed the way her eyes softened when they met mine, as if she was searching for something there, something she wasn't sure she was allowed to take. Time slipped by unnoticed, and when she finally stood to leave, my chest tightened again with that same hollow feeling from the night before. She thanked me, her smile gentle, but just as she turned to go, she hesitated, her hand resting briefly on the back of the chair she had been sitting in. Her eyes met mine one last time, and for a fleeting second, it felt like she wanted to say something more, something she was holding back. Then, with a quiet nod, she stepped out the door. The moment the door clicked shut, the room felt empty again, but not in the same way as before. Now it felt like it had been touched by something fleeting and fragile, something I wasn't ready to lose. I leaned back against the door, closing my eyes, trying to calm the storm rising inside me. I told myself I shouldn't feel this way, that I was reading too much into kindness, but the truth was undeniable, she had left a mark, and I couldn't pretend otherwise. That night, as I lay in bed, I tried to silence my thoughts, but they kept circling back to her. The way she had laughed, the way she had listened, the way her presence seemed to fill every corner of the room without effort. I hugged the blanket tighter, wishing for reasons I didn't want to admit that she would knock again. The days that followed felt strangely different, as if some invisible thread had been tied between me and her, pulling at me in moments when the silence of my apartment grew too heavy. I tried to return to my normal routine, cooking small meals for myself, flipping through the same television shows I never really watched, even attempting to read to distract my thoughts, but nothing worked. Everything felt dull in comparison to the warmth of her presence. I caught myself glancing at the door more often, listening for the familiar firmness of her knock, even when I knew it was unreasonable to expect her. My heart had developed a rhythm of hope and disappointment, beating faster at every sound in the hallway, only to fall quiet again when it was nothing. Then, one evening, just as I had convinced myself I needed to stop obsessing, the knock came. My breath caught before I even moved. It was her. I opened the door, and there she stood, her uniform once again neatly in place, but this time her expression softer, almost hesitant, as though she, too, felt the weight of something unspoken between us. She gave a polite reason for her visit, mentioning that she was following up with residents again, but we both knew there was no urgency behind her words. I invited her in, and she accepted without hesitation. As soon as she stepped inside, the atmosphere shifted, like the room had been waiting for her. We settled into the living room again, and though she carried a small notepad, she barely glanced at it. Instead, she asked me how I had been, her tone personal, curious, almost tender. I answered honestly, telling her about my quiet days, my restless nights, how the apartment seemed to hold too much silence. She listened with an attentiveness that made me feel as though my words mattered, as though my loneliness wasn't just some passing detail but something she truly wanted to understand. The conversation flowed with ease, moving from light topics to deeper ones, as if the walls between us were slowly crumbling. She spoke about the pressures of her job, about how the badge sometimes made people see her as a machine rather than a person with fears, with dreams, with vulnerabilities. I could see the weight in her eyes as she confessed these things, and without thinking, I reached out, resting my hand lightly on the arm of the chair she was sitting in. It was a simple gesture, barely a touch, but the way her eyes flicked to mine in that moment made the air between us crackle with something unspoken. Neither of us pulled away. As the night deepened, our laughter came more easily, spilling out over small jokes and playful remarks. There were pauses too, long silences where our eyes met and held, saying things our lips didn't dare to. I felt myself opening up in ways I hadn't in years, telling her about my failed relationships, about the times I had been too afraid to show my heart, about the quiet ache of wanting to be loved but never quite being chosen fully. She listened without judgment, her gaze steady and compassionate, and then she shared her own truths, about the skepticism she faced among her colleagues, the whispers that followed her because she never quite fit their mold, the loneliness she felt even when surrounded by people. Hearing her speak so honestly created a bond one couldn't ignore. It wasn't just attraction anymore, it was recognition. It was the sense of two souls, battered by different battles, finding a mirror in each other. The hours slipped away unnoticed, the world outside forgotten. At one point, our hands brushed again, and this time neither of us pretended it was accidental. Her fingers lingered against mine, warm and steady, and my heart raced in my chest. There was no dramatic declaration, no sudden confession, but in that quiet touch, everything was said. By the time she stood to leave, the room felt alive with everything we hadn't spoken aloud. She gave me a look before stepping out, one that carried weight and promise, and as the door closed behind her, I pressed my hand to my chest, feeling the thunder of my heartbeat. That night, I couldn't sleep again, but it wasn't restlessness this time, it was the overwhelming awareness that something real was forming, something delicate but undeniable. I lay in bed replaying every moment, every glance, every brush of her hand, realizing that the line between her duty and her heart was beginning to blur. And somewhere deep inside me, a quiet hope grew stronger, whispering that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't just a passing connection. It was the beginning of something that could change everything. It was late on a Friday evening when the sound of her knock returned, but this time something felt different before I even opened the door. There was no official reason written in her stance, no sense of duty on her face when I finally saw her standing there. She wasn't in uniform tonight. She wore simple clothes, a soft sweater, dark jeans, and though her posture still carried the strength of who she was, there was a vulnerability in her eyes that I hadn't seen before. My surprise must have shown because she smiled lightly and said she wasn't here on business, she was just passing by and thought she might stop in. Her voice trembled ever so slightly at the edges, as if she was testing the waters, unsure of whether she had crossed an invisible line. I stepped aside immediately, heart pounding with both excitement and nerves, and let her in. The apartment felt warmer with her presence, almost as if the walls themselves were aware of the shift. We settled on the couch this time, closer than we had ever sat before, the air between us filled with an unfamiliar but thrilling tension. At first, we talked the way we always did, small conversations about work, about the quiet neighborhood, about little things that didn't matter much but filled the silence in a safe way. But soon those words began to trail off, giving space to a quieter connection that didn't need so many explanations. There was a moment where she leaned back, her shoulder almost brushing mine, and I could feel the warmth of her body just inches away. I tried to steady my breathing, but my heart was racing. I caught myself staring at her profile, at the way her hair fell slightly across her cheek, at the soft curve of her mouth when she laughed at something small I had said. And then, as if she could sense the weight of my gaze, she turned her head, and our eyes met. The silence that followed was louder than any conversation we had ever had. She didn't look away, and neither did I. It was as though both of us had been circling this invisible line, afraid to cross it, yet desperate to. She finally whispered that she hadn't planned to come by, but she couldn't stop herself, that she had been thinking about me more than she should have. Her words hung in the air, delicate and vulnerable, and I felt my chest tighten with a mix of fear and exhilaration. I confessed, in my own trembling voice, that she had been on my mind too, that her visits had become the brightest part of my days. It felt reckless to admit it, but at the same time, it felt like the most honest thing I had said in years. Her hand moved slightly, almost without thought, and brushed against mine. This time it wasn't an accident, and neither of us pretended otherwise. Her fingers lingered, hesitant but yearning, and I turned my hand to hold hers fully. The contact was electric, soft and grounding all at once. We sat like that for a long while, holding on to each other in silence, as though words would only cheapen the weight of what we felt. The night stretched on, and the atmosphere between us grew heavier, charged with something unspoken. She told me softly that she was scared of what this could mean for her job, for the image she was expected to keep. But she also admitted she hadn't felt this kind of connection in years, if ever. Her honesty pierced through me, because I felt the same fear, the same conflict, yet also the same undeniable pull. I told her I didn't know what the future would look like, but I knew that when she was near, I felt alive in a way I hadn't in so long. We didn't rush anything. We didn't need to. The night became a series of small moments, our hands never letting go, our voices softening to whispers, our laughter carrying a tenderness that filled the apartment with a warmth I had never felt before. At one point she leaned her head against my shoulder, and I closed my eyes, savoring the quiet intimacy of the moment, feeling her weight against me as proof that this wasn't just a dream. By the time she finally rose to leave, the hesitation in her steps told me she didn't truly want to go. At the door, she lingered, her hand still holding mine, her eyes searching mine for something neither of us could yet say out loud. And though she eventually let go and stepped into the night, the connection between us didn't fade. It only grew stronger, burning quietly inside me long after the door closed. That night, as I lay in bed, I touched the spot on my hand where her fingers had been, feeling the ghost of her warmth still there. My heart was restless, my mind alive with every moment we had shared. It wasn't just the start of something, it was the quiet breaking open of a wall I had built around myself for years. And now that it had cracked, I knew there was no going back. The days after that night felt like I was walking through a dream that refused to end. Every thought I had seemed to circle back to her, the way her hand had rested in mine, the way her head had leaned against my shoulder, the way her eyes had lingered at the door like she was leaving behind a piece of herself. I tried to go through my daily routine, but everything felt strangely sharpened, more alive, because every sound and sight seemed to remind me of her. Yet with the sweetness came a weight, a fear that crept into my chest when I thought too much about the reality of what we were stepping into. She was not just a woman, she was a police officer with a duty and a reputation. I was not just a lonely neighbor, I was someone she wasn't supposed to be entangled with. The thought of what people might say, of what she could lose if anyone found out, haunted me even as I craved every moment with her. When she returned one evening, the knock felt different again, heavier, almost impatient. I opened the door and saw it immediately in her eyes, something was troubling her. She stepped inside quickly, her shoulders tense, her voice quieter than usual as she said she had needed to see me. She didn't even pretend this time, there was no excuse about checking on the neighborhood. She sat down heavily, running her hands over her face, and admitted that her colleagues had been suspicious. They had noticed how often she lingered at my building, how her visits lasted longer than necessary. One had even made a joke that stung more than she wanted to admit. She told me she hated feeling like she had to explain herself at work, that every glance over her shoulder made her second guess if she was allowed to be here at all. Hearing the frustration in her voice, I felt a pang of guilt. I told her I didn't want to be the reason she was questioned or doubted, that I understood if she wanted to step back. But as soon as the words left my mouth, her hand shot out to grasp mine, her eyes fierce and desperate. She told me she couldn't stay away, that no matter the risks, being here with me was the only thing that felt real anymore. Her words broke something open in me. I confessed through trembling lips that I had been terrified too, terrified of what this meant, of how easily I could lose her, of how fragile everything felt. I admitted I hadn't let myself care this deeply about anyone in years because I couldn't bear the thought of watching it all crumble again. My voice cracked as I told her how afraid I was of giving her my heart only to watch her walk away one day. She listened in silence, her thumb brushing over the back of my hand, her eyes never leaving mine. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said that she was afraid of the same thing, that she was scared of falling too hard, of letting me see her completely, but that it was already too late because I was inside her heart in a way no one else had ever been. The weight of those words pressed down on us, and before I realized it, I was crying. Not sobs, not uncontrollable weeping, but silent tears that slipped down my face as all the loneliness and fear I had carried seemed to pour out. She leaned closer, brushing them away gently with her fingers, and then pulled me into her arms. I sank against her, feeling her strength, her warmth, her trembling heartbeat matching mine. We stayed like that for what felt like forever, holding on to each other as though the world outside might shatter us if we let go. When I finally pulled back, I looked into her eyes and saw the same storm I felt inside, fear and love intertwined, fragile but undeniable. It was then, in that charged silence, that something shifted between us. She cupped my face in her hands and whispered that she couldn't keep hiding what she felt. Her lips hovered near mine, hesitant, trembling, and I could feel her breath mingling with mine. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might give me away, but I didn't care. I closed the distance, and for the first time our lips met. The kiss was not rushed, not wild, it was slow, deliberate, filled with every unsaid word we had been holding back. It was soft but overwhelming, tender but fiery, a kiss that felt like a promise we weren't ready to speak aloud yet. When we finally pulled apart, breathless and shaken, there was a silence between us, but it wasn't empty. It was full of meaning, full of the acknowledgement that something irreversible had happened. She pressed her forehead to mine, whispering that she didn't know what the future would hold, but she knew she couldn't let this go. I whispered back that I didn't want her to. We stayed close for the rest of the night, not rushing anything further, just existing in the fragile safety of each other's presence. The fear of the world outside still lingered, heavy and real, but in that moment, it didn't matter. All that mattered was that we had stepped across the line together, and there was no turning back. By the time she left, the air between us was charged with both fear and hope. I closed the door and leaned against it, my lips still tingling, my body still trembling. I knew things would only grow more complicated from here, that the risks were greater now than ever, But I also knew something else with absolute certainty. I was in love with her, and no amount of fear could erase that truth. The days that followed our first kiss felt both like a dream and a dangerous secret we were protecting with every breath. Each time she knocked on my door, my pulse raced with both joy and fear. We had crossed a line we could never uncross, and though it terrified us, it also pulled us closer together in a way that made the risk feel almost worth it. She began coming more often, sometimes late at night after her shifts when exhaustion weighed heavy on her, sometimes in the quiet afternoons when she claimed she was just passing by. But I knew the truth, and so did she. These visits were no longer about routine checks or neighborly conversations, they were about us, about carving out small pieces of time where we could be ourselves, free from the watchful eyes of a world that would never understand. We started sharing the simplest of things, yet they felt extraordinary. We would cook together, laughing over my clumsy way of chopping vegetables or the way she always tried to season food with too heavy a hand. We would sit on the couch for hours, her head resting against my shoulder, talking about nothing and everything all at once. There were moments when she would drift off to sleep against me, and I would just watch her breathe, amazed that someone so strong and untouchable in the eyes of others could look so peaceful, so fragile, when she was with me. I memorized the sound of her laughter, the shape of her smile, the way her fingers traced idle patterns on my skin when she thought I wasn't noticing. Every detail became precious, a piece of her I wanted to hold on to forever, but as much as our secret world filled me with happiness, the reality outside our door was always there, pressing down on us like a weight we couldn't escape. She would talk about her colleagues sometimes, the way their words carried judgment even when they pretended to be jokes, the way they questioned her loyalty or her focus when she seemed distracted. I could see the stress in her shoulders, the exhaustion in her eyes, and I knew I was part of the reason. She was living two lives, the officer everyone expected her to be and the woman who came here to me, stripped of the uniform, stripped of the armor, just herself. I often wondered if I was asking too much of her, if loving me was something she could carry alongside the badge she wore with such pride. One night, as we lay side by side, she confessed that she sometimes feared she couldn't give me what I needed, that her world was too complicated, too heavy, to let love flourish in it. My heart ached hearing her doubts, and I reached for her hand, squeezing it tightly. I told her that I wasn't asking for perfection, that all I wanted was honesty and presence, that the moments we had together meant more to me than anything else. I told her that even if we could never walk in the open, even if our love had to live in the shadows, I would choose it, I would choose her. My words broke something inside her because tears welled in her eyes, and she whispered that no one had ever chosen her so fiercely before. Our kisses grew deeper, filled with both passion and desperation, as though each one was a way of reminding ourselves that we were still here, still fighting against the fear. Sometimes we laughed, teasing each other about silly things, but often we fell into silences that were thick with unspoken emotions, our bodies leaning into each other like magnets. There were nights when we couldn't resist the pull of our desire, when our love became something physical, raw, and undeniable. In those moments, I felt her walls crumble, felt the truth of her heart pressed against mine, and I knew that no matter how dangerous this was, it was real. Yet even in our happiest moments, the shadows loomed. I noticed the way she sometimes tensed at the sound of footsteps outside my door, the way she checked her phone too often, as though waiting for some signal that our secret had been discovered. I started worrying more too, not just for myself but for her, for the way the world could strip her of everything she had worked for if they found out, for the way people could twist something beautiful into something shameful. That fear lived alongside our love, a constant reminder that every moment we shared was both a gift and a gamble, but even with the fear, neither of us pulled away. In fact, it seemed to make us cling tighter to one another. Our little rituals became our lifelines. I would wait for her knock like a child waiting for a miracle, and when she came, I would let her in and shut the door against the rest of the world. Inside, it was just us, and that was enough. She told me once, with a trembling voice, that this place felt like home to her, that I felt like home. And when she said it, I realized that for the first time in years, I felt the same. One night, after a long day that had clearly drained her, she sat with her head in her hands, confessing that she didn't know how long she could keep living this double life. She said she feared she would break under the weight of it, that loving me had shown her a kind of freedom she craved, but also a risk she didn't know if she was brave enough to face. I held her then, tighter than ever, and whispered that love was always a risk, but it was the kind of risk that made life worth living. I told her that she didn't have to decide everything right now, that all we had to do was hold on to what we had, one moment at a time. As she drifted to sleep in my arms, her breath soft against my neck, I stared into the dark and realized how deeply I had fallen. This wasn't just a fleeting connection or a stolen romance. This was love, messy and complicated and frightening, but love nonetheless. And though the future terrified me, though the outside world threatened to tear us apart, I knew one truth with absolute clarity: I would fight for her, for us, for this fragile and beautiful thing we had found. The tension began to build in ways I could no longer ignore. For weeks, our secret world had felt safe behind my closed door, but the world outside seemed to be creeping closer, demanding to be acknowledged. It started with a neighbor, a woman who lived 2 doors down and had a habit of watching everything through her half-open blinds. One afternoon, as I stepped out to collect the mail, she smiled at me in that knowing way, the kind of smile that wasn't really friendly but sharp, probing. She made a casual remark about how often the police had been visiting me, her voice light but her eyes heavy with curiosity. I forced a laugh and brushed it off, but inside, panic stirred. I rushed back inside and locked the door, pressing my back against it, my mind already spinning with the possibilities of what people were beginning to notice. When she came by that night, I told her about the neighbor, about the way her questions had made my stomach twist. She grew quiet, her jaw tightening, her hand flexing nervously on her knee. Then she told me about her colleagues, how the jokes about her lingering visits were growing louder, no longer just whispers but pointed remarks thrown across desks. One of them had teased her openly, asking if she had found a new girlfriend in the neighborhood, and though she had laughed it off at the time, the words had stung because they cut too close to the truth. I could see the storm in her eyes as she spoke, the weight of her badge pulling against the freedom of her heart. She admitted she felt trapped, torn between the duty she had sworn to uphold and the love she was terrified to lose. We argued for the first time that night. The fear had been building inside both of us, and it finally spilled out. I told her I didn't want to be the reason her career crumbled, that I didn't want my love to become her weakness. She shot back that I wasn't her weakness, I was her strength, but that she couldn't carry this burden alone if I kept second-guessing us. Our voices rose, our words sharp with frustration and fear, but beneath it all, what we were really saying was the same: we were terrified of losing each other. I turned away at one point, tears stinging my eyes, whispering that maybe it would be easier if we stopped before we destroyed ourselves. The silence that followed was unbearable, and when I finally dared to look back at her, her face was pale, her eyes shining with hurt. She stood and crossed the room in 2 steps, pulling me into her arms before I could protest. Her voice was low, breaking as she told me not to say those words again, that walking away from me would shatter her in ways she couldn't survive. She admitted she was scared, but that every moment with me made her stronger, made her feel more alive than she ever had. I clung to her then, sobbing quietly into her shoulder, realizing how fragile we both were beneath the masks we tried to wear. That night, our embrace was fiercer than ever, our love laced with desperation. We held on to each other as though the world outside might storm through the walls at any second and tear us apart. In the days that followed, we tried harder to protect our secret. She stopped wearing her uniform when she came by, choosing instead simple clothes that made her blend in more easily. I became more careful about my neighbors, timing my errands when the hallways were empty, keeping my blinds half closed even when I longed for sunlight. It felt like living in 2 realities, the one where we were free inside these walls, laughing and holding each other as though nothing else mattered, and the one outside, where eyes and whispers threatened to unravel everything, but even with the fear pressing closer, our love grew deeper. Perhaps it was the danger that made every moment feel sharper, more alive, but I think it was more than that. I began to see her in layers, not just as the strong officer who carried authority wherever she went, but as the woman who laughed until she cried when I burned toast, the woman who hummed softly under her breath when she was relaxed, the woman whose hand shook slightly when she was nervous but steadied when they touched mine. And she began to see me not just as the woman waiting behind the door, but as someone who gave her a safe place to fall, someone who listened to her fears without judgment, someone who chose her despite the risks. Still, there were nights when the arguments returned. They weren't about love, never about love, but about the weight of the world pressing in. She would come to me tired and restless, saying she couldn't keep lying to herself, that she wanted to hold my hand outside without worrying who might see. And I would remind her of the cost, the cruel way society could strip us bare and laugh at our pain. Our words would clash, sharp and painful, but every time, we would end in the same place, wrapped in each other's arms, whispering apologies through tears, promising we would find a way somehow. It was as though fighting was just another way of proving how much we needed each other, how deeply we were tethered. One night, after one of those arguments, we sat in silence for a long time, both of us drained. She reached for my hand, her grip trembling, and whispered that she didn't care what the world thought anymore, that she couldn't keep living in fear. Her voice cracked as she told me she loved me, the words finally spoken aloud, raw and real. I froze, breath caught in my throat, and then I said it back, my voice shaking but certain. The moment stretched between us, fragile but powerful, and I realized that despite everything, the neighbors, the whispers, the risks, we had already made our choice. From that night on, something shifted. The fear was still there, but so was a new kind of courage. We knew the world might never understand us, but inside these walls, we understood each other, and that was enough to keep going. The day everything changed arrived quietly, almost without warning, like a storm that builds silently on the horizon until it crashes down all at once. She had come to me late in the evening, her face pale, her shoulders heavy with a weight I had never seen her carry before. I knew before she spoke that something was wrong. She shut the door behind her and leaned against it, her eyes meeting mine with a mixture of fear and resolve. She told me that her colleagues had started asking direct questions now, no longer hiding their suspicions. One of them had followed her after her shift, just to see where she was going, and though she had shaken him off, the danger was clear. They were watching her, waiting for her to slip, ready to expose her. I felt my chest tighten, the walls of our secret world suddenly smaller, more fragile than ever. I wanted to scream, to cry, to beg her to stay hidden, but when I looked at her, I saw something stronger than fear in her eyes. She wasn't just tired of hiding, she was done with it. She walked across the room and took my hands in hers, her grip firm, her voice trembling but steady as she said she couldn't keep living in pieces. She wanted to live fully, even if it meant facing the fire. I tried to argue, my words tumbling out in panic, telling her it was too dangerous, that the world would never forgive her, that she could lose everything she had worked for. But she silenced me with a touch, pressing her fingers gently against my lips, her eyes shining with tears. She whispered that none of it meant anything if she couldn't share her life with me, if she couldn't love me openly. Her words broke me open in ways I hadn't expected. I had carried so much fear, so much caution, believing safety could be found in silence, but in that moment, I realized I was just as tired as she was. Tired of pretending, tired of waiting for the knock at the door that would tear us apart. I had been telling myself that protecting her meant hiding, but perhaps protecting her meant standing beside her no matter what. With trembling hands, I cupped her face and told her that if she was ready to face the world, then I would stand with her. No more running, no more silence. The tears slipped down both our faces as we kissed, not desperate this time, but with a fierce certainty that felt like freedom. The days that followed were the hardest and yet the most liberating of our lives. She stopped making excuses at work, no longer covering her visits with half-truths. She told her closest colleague first, someone she trusted, someone she prayed would understand. And though the woman's face had gone pale with surprise, she didn't betray her. Slowly, word began to spread, and the whispers grew sharper, but for once, we weren't hiding. She would come to my apartment in uniform sometimes, no longer changing her clothes in the car, no longer pretending she wasn't here for me. At first, the stares from my neighbors were unbearable, but after a while, they softened, some with curiosity, some with respect, others with quiet disapproval. But none of it mattered, because for the first time, we were walking through it together. There were days of cruelty too, snide remarks from her colleagues, judgmental glares from strangers, moments that cut deep into our skin. One evening, she came to me shaking, her voice raw as she admitted that someone at work had mocked her in front of others, saying she was a disgrace to the badge. I held her then, rocking her gently, whispering that love was never a disgrace, that courage was not shameful. My words didn't erase the pain, but they gave her strength to face another day. And in return, she gave me courage too, reminding me that I was no longer the woman hiding behind locked doors, but someone brave enough to love out loud. Our love became a fire that burned brighter the more the world tried to dim it. We began to dream out loud, about moving in together, about building a home where no one could question our right to exist, about living a life not defined by fear but by choice. We knew the risks hadn't vanished, that the world still held shadows waiting to pounce, but we no longer let them silence us. We laughed louder, held hands longer, kissed when we wanted to, and let our hearts be seen. And though there were scars forming from the battles we fought, those scars became proof of our resilience. One evening, as we sat together by the window, the city lights flickering in the distance, she leaned her head against mine and whispered that she had never believed love could be this powerful. I told her neither had I, but that maybe that was the point. Love wasn't meant to be safe, it was meant to be real. We stayed there in silence, breathing together, the weight of our journey heavy between us, but also the promise of what lay ahead. Our story wasn't perfect, it wasn't easy, but it was ours. And in a world that had tried to make us small, tried to keep us silent, we had found the strength to stand, to speak, to love without apology. Every risk, every tear, every moment of fear had led us here, to a love that refused to be hidden. And as I looked into her eyes that night, I knew with absolute certainty that no matter what storms came, we would face them side by side, unafraid, unashamed, and unbroken.